others can join as they're able. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this monthly meeting of the Emerging Technology COI and ACT-IAC. Boy, do I feel like we have a real treat for you today. Not only do we have an interesting topic in ubiquitous technological surveillance, but it's also being presented to us in a very special way by one of the cohorts from the 2024 Associates Group. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping as we get started here and just give some overview on the COI writ large for a couple of minutes. So as I said, this is the October monthly meeting of our COI. You should know by way of background that the Emerging Technology COI is one of a number of COIs across the ACT-IAC community. It happens to be the largest COI for what it's worth. We have about 1,000 people on the list total. And things being what they are with the emerging technology landscape, we obviously cover a lot of ground. And so the way that that's typically done is through a number of different working groups. So people are able to specialize in their particular emerging technology interest areas. And so what you see here gives you a little bit of an overview of what those working groups are, but also just as importantly, gives you the lay of the land of what the upcoming year is going to look like for these monthly meetings. As I mentioned, this month's meeting is from the Dream Team cohort from the 2024 Associates. They're going to be talking about ubiquitous technological surveillance. Next month, we're lucky enough this year that we have 2 cohorts of associates. Next month, we're going to have our second group speak to us about leveraging AI to modernize legacy code in federal civilian agencies. So they're doing a white paper on that. I always sort of like to quip, over the summer, I was in an interagency meeting and there was some discussion around sort of the dire need in some areas of government for people that know how to do COBOL, such that they were talking about trying to set up a COBOL university to help continue to develop those skills. But then, of course, we have these alternative ways where we can hopefully, over time, get ourselves out of that conundrum, as it were. But that being said, we also have a working group on quantum. There's a new working group that started this year, which is the disruptors in government. This is a really interesting group that is working to figure out how across any domain, an agency and its industry partners can work to keep itself up with the accelerating pace of change. We know that things are not changing slower. If anything, they're changing more quickly, not just in the technology, but in workforce matters and procurement matters. And so forth. And so how can we help ourselves keep up to date with these changes? And it so happens that the cohort this month was sponsored by the Disruptors in Government group. We also have a Smart Cities and IoT working group. We have a DevSecOps working group, Artificial Intelligence, which is, as you can imagine, perhaps our most active and busy one. And Dr. Tibbetts, who will be the moderator today, comes from that. He's one of the government chairs for that group. And of course, we also have a blockchain group. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to give you the lay of the land here in terms of the work that all of the different working groups are pursuing. If you have an interest in joining any of them, if any of this catches your eye, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at any of the addresses that you may have. As I said, the DIG is one that has quite a bit of energy around it. They're taking on an interesting project around human-centered design. And as I said, the AI working group is the largest. They've already have collateral out there around an AI playbook and an AI primer. They're looking at perhaps doing an update on that this year. Obviously, a lot's changed from one year to the next, much less since 2020 in that space. So moving on to the next slide, just wanted to put a quick plug in here for anybody that's interested in joining the COI. At the leadership level, we always have opportunities for you to be able to do that. And I just note here, we actually have an open position within our quantum working group for a government chair. Would really look forward to finding somebody that would be interested in doing that. And by the way, you don't necessarily have to be an absolute expert in these things to do this. If you're good at organizing and you're good with people, that's a great start. And if you're passionate and interested in the topic, and that goes for being on the leadership team or also being a member and a participant in these working groups. So we want to always try to make sure that we're open to everybody. So look us up on LinkedIn. And that being said, quick overview of what we're about to discuss here in terms of the personalities and players involved. Today, as I had mentioned, Dr. Paul Tibbetts is going to be a moderator for our associates panel. He's also the co-chair for the AI working group. Dr. Tibbetts is a senior government leader with over 30 years of experience. He'll be moderating today's session, and Dr. Tibbetts has a distinguished career driving innovation and transformation across federal agencies, making him uniquely positioned to lead today's discussion. Dr. Tibbetts will be interviewing our presenters, Abigail Bryant, Tiffany Ceasor, Lila Najmyar, Taylor McCarty, and Riley Clark, who are all members, as I had mentioned, of this year's Associates Dream Team. And by the way, if you're among the early career talent that is out there, I would encourage you to take a look at the Associates program. I believe their application period is typically in the January to February timeframe. It's really a great way to get involved with ACT-IAC and network with people outside of your company or agency. So our associates will be diving into ubiquitous technological surveillance, and they'll be exploring what it could mean for the next 5 to 10 years. With Dr. Tibbetts guiding this conversation, expect an insightful and thought-provoking discussion on the impact of UTS and what lies ahead. And with that being said, Dr. Tibbetts, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Rob, thanks so much for the kind words and the introduction. Indeed, I actually believe my own opinion after reading this about this subject that universal technical surveillance is the topic of the moment. And I think it's extremely timely and wonderful that the associates wanted to dig into that subject. So quite frankly, I'm looking forward to learning a lot from what the associates have to say and from the discussion. So thanks very much, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Taylor McCarty, and I'm just going to get us kicked off really quickly talking about what is UTS. So UTS is the widespread collection, processing, and analyzing of data. Basically, anywhere you can be surveilled, anywhere your data can be collected, it is collected. And we're going to go a little bit more into detail about that. So thank you.
All right, guys, I'll be taking us through just a brief overview of the history of surveillance. So kicking off in the 1950s, the concept of surveillance began taking shape during the Cold War. The US government and Soviet Union began using electronic surveillance to monitor each other's activities, and these early methods involved wiretapping and phone tapping. Simple and difficult to work with, but they set the foundation for broader government surveillance operations in agencies like the FBI. So in the, we can go to the next slide. In the 1960s and 1970s, the concern of privacy. We're only seeing the top half? Okay.
It works.
Sorry. The concern over privacy was growing as surveillance capabilities expanded. The US Corona project was one of the first successful examples of satellite surveillance. This project involved launching a large camera into Earth's orbit, photographing specific points and areas on the Earth's surface, and then parachuting a film capsule back down to Earth. So this image was actually taken by Corona and shows a Soviet Air Force base. It's one of the hallmarks of early remote surveillance, and it was around the same time that the FBI was ramping up their counterintelligence program, which infiltrated and monitored activist groups across the US to counter what it viewed as domestic threats. Databases were increasing in volume of information, and records were being digitized for easier access. So this led to an uprising of privacy concerns that resulted in the Privacy Act of 1974. This act stated that agencies had to establish protections over data storage, which ensured that individuals could review and correct their records and limited data sharing without consent. Next slide. In the 1980s, the advancements in computer technology made it possible to process large volumes of data, and surveillance was rapidly expanding into new areas. The internet was born in 1983, and home computers were rapidly becoming more affordable and accessible, with Apple and IBM as the household names. Computers were already vital to government and corporate operations. They allowed for easier collection, analysis, and storage of information. At the same time, intelligence agencies were experimenting with digital data monitoring, laying the groundwork for future network surveillance systems. Corporate surveillance was also taking root as companies began tracking consumer data for marketing purposes. These forms of digital observation showed just how seamlessly technical surveillance could be implemented both into the government and the private sectors. Next slide. So in 1991, Mark Weiser, who was the chief technology officer of Xerox PARC at the time, wrote a groundbreaking paper titled Computers in the 21st Century, which was centered on the concept of ubiquitous technology and the impact that it was going to have on daily life. He hypothesized a short glimpse into daily life with ubiquitous tech, where devices would respond intuitively from making coffee when they woke up to locating lost items and assisting with work, car systems that could aid with traffic, and virtual offices, which could enhance collaboration with colleagues. The 90s as a whole marked a turning point with the rise of the internet, leading to the emergence of digital and network surveillance. Agencies like the NSA expanded capabilities and developed programs like Echelon, which was a global surveillance network that could intercept communications across countries. In the corporate world, companies like Google and Amazon collected massive amounts of consumer data and introduced targeted advertising and personalized content for the ease of browsing and shopping. These practices actually blurred the lines between governmental and corporate data collection as private companies became major players in information gathering. Following 9/11, the government passed the Patriot Act in 2001, which allowed intelligence agencies more extensive access to personal information, which led to an unprecedented growth in surveillance. All right, next slide. From 2010 onwards, surveillance entered a new era powered by artificial intelligence, big data, and machine learning. AI is allowing agencies and corporations to analyze vast data sets in real time and pull patterns in behavior, location, and communications that it would just be impossible to track manually. Facial recognition is widespread, used by both governments and private companies, from everything from law enforcement to customer tracking in stores. Social media itself adds a whole other dimension, which allows both governments and companies to monitor people's social connections, preferences, and daily activity. So today in 2024, surveillance is actually fully integrated into our digital lives, just as predicted back in the 90s. Our smartphones, wearables, and smart home devices collect data on our locations, activities, and communications almost continuously. So on one hand, they offer convenience and security, but on the other hand, it brings in the question of protecting our privacy in a time where personal information can constantly be gathered and analyzed. Next slide.
Yes, so thank you so much, Abigail. So shifting gears onto who uses UTS. So with Ubiquitous Technical Surveillance, I'll say UTS for short, the United States government developed this concept to just be able to describe those threats posed by the governments worldwide, and this escalating use of technology to be able to track the movements of the citizens and reconstruct their activities over time. It's not surprising at all at this list because it affects all tradecraft, the technical, operational, administrative, and every contested physical environment, technical environment, and cyber environment. So as you can see, we have the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, obviously the US government, and then smart cities such as China, which is our big proponent that I will be discussing in a bit, as well as Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and then even some US companies looking to collect this data and find ways to market to their consumers. Currently, right now, the EU is reviewing regulations to give its citizens explicit rights over the use of the facial recognition of data. And tech giants like Microsoft and Amazon, they're very advanced in deploying this technology as well, but they're calling for the clear legal parameters to be able to govern the uses. Especially since this, like I said before, attracts and affects all tradecraft. Next slide, please. Going into the potential threats and uses, there is a current lack of awareness for these issues and threats, and because of that lack, there's a bunch of recommended actions that prevents a successful narrative. And the United States specifically requires a broad and well-coordinated understanding and approach to this cultural change. So it's important to note these potential threats and uses, especially in general, as well as business and industry uses. So the ability to collect and store data has become increasingly easier and cheaper, as well as for adversaries to be able to track our data because it's so much easier and cheaper. It's so common, especially in our data, our movements, and our daily activity. Especially in data collection. I'm sure you guys are all aware of the selling and collection of data for marketing purposes for companies. Next slide, please. And then going into the business and industry threats and uses, we know UTS brings major threats to the intelligence community, the DoD and the United States government, but also important to note for the non-state actors like insider threats, foreign terrorists, transnational criminal organizations, as well as others that pose a threat to the DoD personnel at home and abroad. Next slide, please. And then going into more on our smart cities, specifically China, of the nearly 1 billion surveillance cameras around the world, more than half are located in China. So this is a big proponent that we will be discussing within this. They also use big data and surveillance to instill this positive behavior in its citizens with the social credit system and also exporting its AI-powered surveillance technology to other authoritarian governments around the world. So I know that there are other countries stepping up to the plate with this. For example, London, they just made their first police arrest based on facial recognition. So it isn't just China being advanced in this. India, for instance, was just able to work on a trial of facial recognition this year alone. They were able to recognize about 3,000 missing kids in just 4 days. So a lot of countries are becoming more advanced with this data collecting system and being able to use this facial recognition. Same thing with the United States, with a lot of data collecting, being able to check for credit card swindlers, more data collection mechanisms that are just more common now. Other countries are signing deals with China even for their biometric surveillance. So this is just something that poses a huge threat, but it's also something to be aware of how this is just becoming so advanced and how critical it is for the next couple years, especially the 5 to 10 years from now with the advancements of technology. But next slide, please.
Awesome. Thanks, Lila.
Of course.
So I'm going to go into what UTS entails. So UTS is broken down into 5 main threat vectors: online, electronic, visual, physical, financial, and travel. Next slide, please. So online threat vector, what is it? This vector is built mainly on the ability to use advertising information and any information that's been pulled from social media platforms to develop patterns for a person or group's life and kind of how they go about things. It creates a fingerprint, and it does that by capturing things like transactions on account holders, online activity, social media posts, likes, shares, and then unique device identifiers that are also associated. As we mentioned, it's great for advertisers because advertisers can buy this information and this data and use it based on people's patterns. As we've all seen, I think, we've all maybe been prone to, oh, wow, I just talked to my friend about this, and now all of a sudden I'm getting these targeted ads for something that I haven't even searched for yet, right? There's a lot going on with all of a sudden what you're looking for shows up. And it's because advertisers can purchase this information on you and use it to their advantage. Alternatively, adversaries can also buy this information, right? And so whether or not you use it for good or for malicious intent, adversaries can use this and buy it and try to figure out your patterns and determine anomalies to those patterns and how they can potentially exploit that. Next slide, please. So the electronic vector, this is for location-based signals that are transmitted from various electronic devices. So anything like Wi-Fi, radio frequencies, and vehicle telematic devices, excuse me. Anywhere from like your locations device, the user info associated with that device, and user preferences on those devices are all captured. And a few devices that can capture data: your accelerometer, how far you've gone, how many steps, what direction you're going, how fast you're going. Your gyroscope, you can check your altitude and position, even which way your phone is pointing. So you can locate, oh, this person was at this point. Were they looking towards this building or were they looking that way? And you can get that information. GPS, your location, even if your GPS setting is turned off, that can still be accessed. Altitude and air pressure associated with your barometer. For proximity sensor, you can determine, when your phone is near your body, depending on other vectors in concert. And you've got things like ambient light sensors. You can check how much light is in your environment and build a pattern based off of that. Another key thing with the electronics sector is it gives adversaries your phone's IMEI or your computer's MAC address, which are those unique device identifiers. Next slide, please. Another big one for electronics is vehicle telematics. I know with all these electronic cars these days, vehicles getting a lot more technologically savvy. There's a lot more that goes into vehicles. It's not going to be your 1960s classic muscle cars with virtually no technology in them. You can get things like your acceleration, braking. You can look at if someone has their door open or if their trunk's open. You can look at fuel efficiency, odometer ratings, all for specific vehicles with those unique identifiers. Next slide, please. This is a big one and kind of relates to what Lila was talking about with the smart cities. So the visual physical, vector incorporates all mechanisms that collect data about what you look like, how you move. So that's like those CCTV cameras in the smart cities, smart doorbells, anything else that could collect gait analysis. And this is big for algorithms or pulling data and combing through it for things like facial rec, gait analysis, and they can use adversaries or anyone that wanted to purchase this data could use that information and reconstruct events based on a video feed and put people where they were and kind of play back through. And they can also use it to confirm or disprove electronic data. So for example, if you have a car telematics system that says a car was at a certain place at a certain time, you can use visual physical information to determine if that car was actually where the sensor says it was, or if the camera was off, or if the car was off, right? So it allows you to confirm with multiple data points. Next slide, please. Financial vector, essentially what it sounds like, right? It allows you to track purchase history and outgoing transactions for people. Banks and governments can track money worldwide. And for this, what gets captured, you're looking at things like your account holder info, you're looking at credit cards or various banking transactions, and also unique identifiers, if you can catch a theme, the unique identifiers associated with the particular users for these transactions. Next slide, please. This sector I thought was particularly interesting to me because it got its own category, and I don't think I've ever correlated travel with surveillance personally. I kind of just think, oh, I'm leaving the country. I'm free to do whatever I want, but that's what they want you to think with all this information. You have unique identifiers for your travel records, right? So you have things like your frequent flyer accounts, your hotel accounts, your visa applications, student visa, work visa, anything like that. You've also got data that gets created by various, if you have an organization that's using itineraries to get it out to all their people, if you have things like flights that are getting changed. And then the other cool thing, I don't want to call it cool, the other bit with this is this helps adversaries identify not only where you're going and how you're getting there, but also they can use this information to determine who you meet with while you're there. So not only can they pull information based on my personal online financial travel data, but if my information happens to line up with Lila's information and we were in the same place at the same time, then that creates an additional pattern that either adversaries or advertisers, like we mentioned, can use for their benefit. And I'll pass it to Taylor.
Thanks, Riley. I'm going to be talking a little bit about emerging technology off the bat. So emerging technology and how it relates to UTS. Initially, we'll talk a little bit about enhanced AI capabilities. So obviously, there's more sophisticated decision-making tools for identifying potential threats. And with that, behavioral analytics, which is predictive monitoring through AI-based behavioral patterns. Also, everybody's talked a little bit about smart cities. That's one of the big ones. And drone surveillance as well. It's something that, we haven't really touched on, but there's aerial monitoring with wide coverage. Next slide, please. So some future trends and regulations. Oh, sorry. Next slide. Sorry. Thank you. Some future trends and regulations. So in terms of UTS, there's going to be a growing regulatory landscape. Government and organizations are likely to have more stringent data protection laws. And with that, there's going to be an effort to build AI systems that have more transparency and limit bias in surveillance. Some of the trends that we're going to see, and some that I've recently seen as well, include decentralized surveillance systems, so use of blockchain, as well as surveillance resistance tools, so things to help not be surveilled. So privacy protection tech, including encryption or anti-surveillance clothing, or privacy-focused Internet of Things devices. Next slide, please. Some of the benefits of UTS. So UTS can seem kind of scary, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, but some of the benefits of UTS, crime prevention is a huge one. And one of my colleagues is going to talk a little bit about China and how they're using real-time tracking and predictive policing to help reduce crime rates in China. Smart cities, again, they're amazing. They can help with traffic management, infrastructure monitoring, and disaster response. Health monitoring is another big one. There's wearable tech for people to track vitals and health risk in real time, as well as workplace efficiency. So monitoring employee performance to improve productivity. There's a lot of different benefits for UTS in general. Next slide, please. So here's the ethical and the privacy concerns, kind of the flip side of that coin. Obviously, privacy invasion is a big one, right? People don't want to lose all of their personal privacy, right? There's great things that come from UTS, but we don't want to lose all of our privacy as a person. Data security, government overreach, that's another one. We don't want authoritarian misuse or surveillance, which is kind of what you're seeing in China. There's a mass control and repression. And then surveillance capitalism. Tech companies are using this surveillance data to target advertising and behavioral manipulation. And with that, we kind of go back to that data security piece, where the surveillance technologies that gather vast amounts of your data, and then that just makes all of your data vulnerable to being breached. Next slide, please. And then technological developments in surveillance. Obviously, AI and machine learning, that's a big one. Internet of Things devices, these are devices everywhere in your home, cities, personal gadgets, things that you carry on you, even your vehicles, right? They're continuously tracking your behavior and your location, your likes and your dislikes, right? Biometric data, that's another one. Facial recognition, fingerprinting, DNA tracking, gait analysis. In China, they're even creating an entire database of the male bloodline. So they're collecting blood from men and boys in China. That's another biometric piece. And then drones and satellites. That's the advanced surveillance from above and real-time monitoring of public spaces and private properties. Next slide, please. I'll hand it over to Tiffany. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. So I wanted to take a moment and kind of just paint this picture because, you know, my amazing teammates, they had talked in depth about the history, you know, the different types of techniques, all the different various avenues of collecting this data, analyzing this data, using it for predictive modeling, facial recognition software. But I wanted to take a moment and just paint a picture of civilization that's currently and actively using this technology. So China, as many of us are well aware, are using UTS already in massive ways. They're leveraging AI, big data to really not even just do high, you know, very computationally expensive, you know, algorithms to do predictive stuff, but they're just bringing together every part that makes a person and using that to identify them, like the social credit scoring. So I wanted to take a moment and really just bring us to imagine this world. So in these photos, I know they're a little bit zoomed out, but if you take a good look at them, you can see that they have CCTV cameras going in, looking at the different citizens, right? They have a social credit. So are they good? Are they bad on a score of, you know, 0 to 800, like we have our FICO credit score? How good of a citizen are they? Are they, and you can have all the data from what they're purchasing, their health, their financial debt, to, you know, their hours and the focus at work, and then also obviously crime and, past negative, information like that. And you combine all this to create a score for a person. So for you, Rob or Dr. Tibbetts, I'm going to score you based on everything I know about you, which is everything. And this is a very, very dicey thing because it leads to the authoritarian, dictatorship kind of, a lot of people are fearing for their freedom, right? They feel as if they don't have any. And having personal interviews with people, some people feel like the law enforcement aspect of it is beneficial, where they feel very safe, where there was an interview done where someone had committed a crime with 2 hours, they were tracked down, detained, and arrested. And so those are some of the benefits you see. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, comparing and incentivizing citizens based on all of their personal data is very invasive. But one of the law enforcement applications that you kind of see in the photo here is a really interesting application. I think that could be directly used in our national securities and law enforcement use cases. So they have special glasses that have machine learning facial recognition software attached to them that allow them to look out into a crowd and by facial recognition, deep learning, neural networks, analyze a person's behavior. So do they have suspicious behavior? And even going as far as advancements in emotion analysis, but then also being able to identify if they're criminal or not, right? You can see the red or the green. And this has been very effective in tracking down threats, criminals, and really eradicating a lot of that, not eradicating, but reducing a lot of that. Could we go to the next slide, please? So this is just going more in depth on some of the use cases. So obviously there's the health aspect where they're using it for disease surveillance, control, using a lot of biometric data, like Taylor had mentioned, to trace down, someone's entire lineage and be able to track their movements by, just the DNA of, a single man and all of their relatives. They're also using it in the law enforcement, socially, with trying to incentivize positive behavior through the social credit system. That's not broadly enforced across all of China, but different townships are experimenting with their own credit system and trying to incentivize citizens. For example, you have a half off discount to all of the public services if you have a credit score or a social credit score of over, 680. And then for everyday conveniences, so using facial recognition, fingerprinting to purchase, check into your flights, open up the gates and things to your home, some of those things that are powered by and used in smart cities. And then lastly, for gatekeeping and tracking of minority groups, separationists, people who aren't trying to kind of fall in line with the status quo with UTS and the Chinese government. They're able to track using, facial recognition. When you enter a grocery store, are you within 400 feet of where you're supposed to be? And that is a way that they're using, UTS to gatekeep and really kind of keep people in their lane. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk about UTS in action in the United States. And a lot of us, myself included, were thinking, oh, there's absolutely no way that I want anyone, tracking me, having all my data, knowing my blood type, tracking down my lineage. That's extremely creepy and a violation of, privacy rights and a whole lot of other civil liberties and freedoms that we have in the US. But in certain scenarios, UTS has actually been extremely beneficial. For example, in Disney World, where they have the RFID bracelets and you can use your fingerprint to check in. And now they're implementing facial recognition software so that they could be able to identify each user, and you can use your face to check in and your bracelet to access all of the amenities of the theme park. So in this little world, UTS is heavily involved so that you don't have to bring your credit card open. You don't have to go and ask for your pictures. You can just scan your bracelet and they will automatically upload, and everything is a seamless process. So this is more of the smart city like application of UTS in the US. And then for more of the security law enforcement, we could see that in industries like casinos, where they're using surveillance technology, specifically facial recognition software, to be able to identify suspicious behaviors and threat actors in the casinos, is this person someone who's cheated or stolen, or are they just an overall threat to the casino? And they've seen tremendous positive experience with using surveillance technology and facial recognition software in that light. So we wanted to wrap this up and open it up for the amazing esteemed Dr. Tibbetts to ask us some questions, and then we want to open it up to the audience to ask some questions in the chat. So Dr. Tibbetts, I'm going to hand it over to you and would love for you to give a brief introduction about yourself and begin the panel discussion for us.
Tiffany, thank you so much, and thanks to all the presenters. Very interesting remarks from each of you on in my view, a very interesting subject. I'm a physician by training. Just to try to be brief about this, 26 years active duty in the Navy. Husband, I've been married now 53 years. My 2 kids are 50 years old. I've been in IT in some way, shape, or form since 1988. We deployed email before Bill Gates dreamed up Windows, but anyway, for whatever it's worth. And in DOD, when I was there, I did a lot of work with health IT stuff. I deployed the first and second electronic health records in DOD, CHS, and Alta, if any of you are familiar with those. But anyway, and I've been at VA here now for about 18 years. I guess, first of all, let me, again, thank you. And any of you that were interested in following up on this subject with me and the AI working group, I'd be thrilled. So feel free to write to me, paul.tibbetts@va.gov. I think some of the interesting concepts that came out, and I'll get to the questions in a moment here. I heard words like anywhere, anyone who wants to buy the data can, fully integrated, and then the multiple mechanisms by which data is created. I think you all have painted a very clear picture of what ubiquitous really means in a very graphic way. I mean, I guess a very compelling way. I would say that maybe, from a consideration perspective, one of the frameworks I've run across in my career for artificial intelligence per se, and I think when applied here, it would work, is descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. Descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive might be a framework where we could think more, perhaps in a somewhat of an organized way about how data is being used to describe what we do, to predict what we do, or in fact, to influence our thinking and to get us to do something that someone else wants us to do. And some thoughts in that regard are maybe that would be worth exploring. I don't know, you all, depending on what your interests are, but I heard a lot about privacy and data protection and whatnot, but I think maybe one fruitful avenue of thought might be here to pursue a little bit about, well, suppose there is no privacy breach and suppose there is no security breach. Still, the question remains, what happens to our data? And is it descriptive, predictive, or prescriptive? With no security breach and no privacy breach, then what? So it may lead us to think through perhaps a little bit more deeply about the legal superstructure in which we operate. But anyway, with that said, maybe from a needs perspective, and this is for anyone on the panel who wants to speak up, but whoever wants to take this, in your opinion, what's driving the surge or the need in surveillance technologies?
I can jump in here. So I think a big thing behind the need is convenience. So convenience for security, making it easier to track people who commit crimes. So with facial recognition in China, or the convenience of going to Disney World and not having to carry that extra bag around with you all day, being able to check in through a bracelet or using facial recognition or however they need to do it. It comes with an ease of access to life that has never really been fully realized yet. So moving forward, I think that that's something that can be super exciting, barring the potential for privacy concerns.
Well, you raise a very interesting point, and others may want to chime in on that question, but there's frequently, I won't say always perhaps, but frequently seems to be a benefit risk trade-off. And whenever we get into this being surveilled world, it's because we want to get through the turnstile quickly, or we want to, use the barcode scanners or whatever it is, because it helps us. Well, the fact of the matter behind all that is it's maybe likely helping somebody else to do something else. But I think you raise a great point there. Anyone else want to talk about the need?
I think there's also a need to be the first, right? I think this race to technological advancement has kind of pushed and propelled us forward. Myself as a research data scientist had that itch, that bug, even, when I was building algorithms, you're like, I want to be the first, I want to help someone. And then there came a point where I really had to catch myself and think, is this algorithm, is this model, right, really worth, is it worth going that extra step to have this extra convenience, this extra predictive intelligence? Is that worth the trade-off of the Pandora's box that will be opened and unraveled? And I think we see that a lot right now with kind of this race for generative AI as, a specific subset of machine learning. And so I think that kind of carries itself over to, UTS, and also, okay, I don't want to be, spied on, but other people are already doing it. So how can I be the first one to leverage it?
Great. Thank you so much for that. Let's see, with respect to risks, what are the potential threats, risks, and complications of using AI and UTS? And what hurdles would we need to overcome and risks to look out for? Who wants to take that one?
I can jump in. I would say one of the biggest risks with this is like to Tiffany's point with like wanting to be the first, because this isn't a universally accepted or practiced process. The risk is the unknown, right? Because let's say we start implementing this and you go down a rabbit hole that you can't undo, right? To your descriptive, prescriptive, and I forget what the third one was, but if you don't know what you're doing and we don't have the proper research done ahead of time to go down the path of China and putting our Disneyland, facial rec or ease of access in to the metro, into government buildings to get in places, right? If we do all that, the risk is if we go too far down that path, if you hit a roadblock that this is horrible for data security, like we can't actually protect all our data. What do you do if you've gone too far, right? So I think the risk is with wanting to be the first and with wanting to implement this is making sure that you do the necessary groundwork and due diligence to make sure that it's not going to be this catastrophic turning into a, I don't want to say authoritarian like China, but like going too far down a rabbit hole that we can't come back from.
Yeah, it's like toothpaste. I mean, once you squeeze it out of the tube, you can't squeeze it back in.
Yes, and also going off of what Riley said, I can also jump in. There's always going to be risk, and in this case, I don't think it's just being the sprinter and finishing the race first. It's always proceeding with caution. Like we said with the tech giants like Microsoft and Amazon and how they have deployed these technologies, there are so many legal parameters that need to be in check now to be governed before its use. And I think it's really important to note that there's so many regulations that are currently being governed at the moment to make sure that the citizens using this, like their data of their facial recognition in the United States, is us having our explicit rights for these. It affects so many people. So I think a lot of people are nervous of the risks with data being leaked and all of our information that is so personal being leaked. So definitely have to make sure that we proceed with caution, but still push forward as fast as we can too, so that we can still be at the top with this advancement.
Lila, thank you so much. I guess I'd maybe ask as a potential additional consideration that you might all feel would be worth delving into, and that is, again, what's the impact of all this data collection if there is no leak and there is no breach? The data is still being collected and being used for something with no breach or no privacy violation. How many of us, when we use a system, sign an agreement? And how many of those agreements refer to other agreements? And those agreements refer to other agreements. So my sense of it is it might wind up quite difficult trying to plow through all those third-party agreements to figure out exactly what your risk is, even if there's no breach and there's no privacy violation because you've agreed to the data use. But anyway, it's something I think maybe would be worth thinking about. Let me ask from a technology perspective, what would it look like tangibly from a technical capabilities and infrastructure standpoint to implement this in the next 10 years?
I'm really passionate about this because I'm just a super data nerd. But I think I always say, even when I'm designing and building or leading my organization in data infrastructure, the bottom layer is always the most important. That's the foundation. And that's going to be for UTS is going to be the data governance, but also just the data quality, right? Because we know that sloppy data is going to lead to poor outcomes, mismanaged systems, right? Because all of intelligence, humans, robots, computers, it's all the same. We learn based on our past training data, our past experience. And so if we were to decide we wanted to implement this in a highly regulated, compliant, controlled way that protects citizens' privacy, I think we would need to really start with the data governance, making sure that all bodies are on board, having a simplified, solid, but, exactly what you're saying, Dr. Tibbetts. No one's going to read through the legal jargon that, the privacy team of these big tech companies have spun up, right? Most people will never understand what that means or what a deep convolutional neural network is, right? So that's unfair to the average citizen to make them agree to something that they don't really understand. And so having a simplified base layer of the governance, making sure that all parties are bought in. But then also, if we did want to leverage existing data systems, but have a data quality automated cleaning pipeline. So before the data comes in, it needs to already be, properly cleaned, assessed for the biases, because everything is biased, but it needs to be accounted for. And then building on, the facial recognition software, all of the machine learning, big data analysis and application, but the fabric would need to be laid first. I didn't want to go too much on this because I know Taylor had her hand up wanting to chime in.
Great.
Oh, there was something I just wanted to add to Dr. Tibbetts' point and to yours, Tiffany. You're right. A lot of people aren't going to read through all of the mumbo jumbo and look through everything that their applications, all of that data that's collected. And thankfully, there are applications that are already out there that kind of will look through that for you. So terms of service review.com will actually, you can put in your terms of service and it'll give you a summarized version of the terms of service. So it'll tell you, okay, this is what this is actually asking. Another good website is called Exodus. And that will show you all of the applications that you have and what data they are taking from your phone. So you can kind of lock down your devices based off of what information is being taken. I think one of the big things that we haven't covered and something that's really interesting, right, is the fact that it really depends on how you want to be viewed, right? Some people may not care that their information is being taken and being used to kind of market to them. But in some situations, say from the intelligence community or the DoD, you may want to have a lot smaller of a presence, of an online presence or of a surveillance presence than somebody who doesn't really care about where that data is going. So there are ways to kind of mitigate what that looks like, right? From a technical aspect, there are ways to mitigate based off of, like, say, like I just said, Exodus or terms of service review, or there are plenty of other online resources to kind of mitigate that. But at the end of the day, there's, in the society that we live in, especially living in, a country that has more technological advances, we're going to be surveilled one way or another. If it's important to us, there are ways to mitigate that, though. That's just from my perspective.
And I have something else to add. So I also think that when we're thinking about national security and intelligence surveillance, I do, and if we want to, if we're all on board, which I don't think we will be, I think everybody's going to have different opinions. But if we were, and we were going to move forward with this, I think it would be important to also make sure that there is clear separation and enforcement to the data controller. So the people who house that data, there has to be different boundaries and limitations. Like, for example, in a previous big tech company that I worked for, we have like different substrates, like different very locked down data boundaries that only specific users are able to access this type of, data for different use cases. And so I think having like automated user controls to who can see what type of data would be extremely important. Because if we were going to be in this ubiquitous surveillance world, it would be important that very few, trusted people would, as few people would have access to as much information as possible, right? I think we could do that in like an easy interconnected way technologically, but in terms of the system, I think that the less people who have access to all of this data, the better. I also do think just from, working with, different types of cybersecurity experts, hackers, the people who are always trying to catch or the culprits, the criminals, they're always going to have a way around the system, right? They're going to have a way to circumnavigate with, anti-surveillance technology, clothing, glasses that can refract, our facial recognition within the computer. So, like, there's so many different ways I could just think of algorithms I could start designing to go against some of the facial recognition software. And so keeping that in mind, the surveillance that we might be seeking may not be as effective for the people we're trying to control. And so I say all this as a caveat of surveillance, or just to think, as smart as we are with advancing UTS, there's equally as brilliant of people who are working on things to counteract that. So it might not be as effective in the long run. And I'll hop off my soapbox.
Tiffany, great. Thanks. Thanks to both of you. Okay, my last question is about trust, and then we can open it up if time permits, which I think we have a little bit for others online. How can organizations build trust and confidence in the public with respect to surveillance and or surveillance and AI technologies?
Sure, I can hop in on this one, sir. So in terms of trust, right, data aggregation is a big thing, and there are multiple tiers of data aggregation. There's tier 1 data aggregation and tier 2 data aggregation. In terms of data, companies are going to sell whatever they can, and I'm sure you've probably heard, if you're not paying for something, then you're probably the product, right? I'm sure a lot of people have heard that. In terms of ways that companies can kind of create that trust, is by essentially not selling your data, or if they are, telling you that ahead of time, right? A lot of times they try to hide it in those terms of services, or they try to hide it in, asking for additional permissions. I'm sure that you've seen that some companies can sometimes do things that aren't the best. And one vignette that I can think of off the top of my head is last year, Tesla actually went through a lawsuit for recording inside and outside of their vehicles without consumer knowledge. And they were actually recording adults doing like sexual behavior within those vehicles. And then that was being kind of pushed around inside of Tesla, and they had a huge lawsuit against them because of it. So in terms of data, I mean, data is really who we are. Every piece of data starts building a picture around who we are. And I think the only way to build trust is to protect that data, or at least tell us where that data is going. And I think to be protective of our own data first and foremost, just in the environment that I work in, because I work in an open source area, right? I work open source, and so I have a broad knowledge of where that information is going and who's collecting that information. I think we should be good stewards of our own data first and foremost, and then doing our independent research on those companies, and then finding companies that we can trust because we know where that data is going. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but.
That's great. Great concepts in there. I guess one of the enforcement mechanisms, though, that I've run into, I'm sure many people have, which is if you don't agree to the terms of service or whatever that agreement document is, you can't use the software. So there's a sort of I don't know, an arm twisting kind of catch to all that, which is, even if you do have the potential to know if you want to use the product, you have to agree to it anyway sometimes. But anyway, very interesting. I guess we can throw it open for questions. The last comment I would add that maybe you all might want to think about is reinforcement learning, and what happens if we people think about ourselves as the robot, and we think about ourselves as subject to a Markov decision process, where rewards are maximized for taking certain routes and minimized with penalty for taking other routes. What happens if we, the people, are the robot and we're the subject of the reinforcement learning? But anyway, I think I'll leave that just as an open question to think about. And maybe Tiffany, over to you. If there's some, we have time for a question or two online, if there are any.
Left, but we also got two questions, so I'll read through it. First
Great.
question is, how much do you predict UTS and AI can be used to mold society? Who decides how that should and how much that affects culture?
Someone on the panel want to take that?
You have 1 minute, guys.
Yeah, I can open it up really quickly. Basically, I mean, the people that own that data, the people that purchase that data, right, are the ones that are kind of in charge of that. And at the end of the day, who's going to be purchasing the majority of that data? Well, the government and or businesses, right? That's where a majority of that data goes, because like I said, that data is us. So they're trying to get a bigger picture of us so that they can either market to us, or control us, right? At the end of the day, that's kind of where it comes from. If you're in a society that you're not, you're more doled down, right? If somebody knows how to market to you, if somebody knows how to control you, then you're easier placed in society. And I think that it just comes down to the government and businesses. From my perspective, if anybody else on the panel wants to chime into that, I know we don't have much time.
Yeah, I also think it comes down to the scientists and also just the people. Like, we have control over this, and if it goes and doesn't go. And so I just was going to end that because we have 1 more minute.
I have like one more little bit to add on to that. It also depends on the people as a whole. So if you start telling people that they're about to be tracked, or your social media, or your watch, whatever you watch on television, so on and so forth, if that's all going to be tracked, then people could start trying to cater a specific image of themselves through all that they want to portray. But I feel like that opens it up to a whole other can of worms.
Yeah. Yeah, the Markov decision process. Exactly. Where we try to optimize the rewards to us. Exactly right.
But to close us off, since we are at time, if any of our presenters could answer, if you could give one piece of advice for navigating the future of UTS, what would that be?
I think from my perspective, it's just dependent on, like I said earlier, kind of what information you want out there about yourself. To navigate it from my perspective, I don't want as much of a surveillance perspective, right? So it's more important to me to be a good steward of like protecting my own data, making sure that I know where my information's going, making sure that, you know, I know who's buying my information, or making sure that, you know, those tier 2 data aggregators don't have my information. And there's ways to opt out of that as well. So that's just from my perspective. Yes.
I completely second. I would definitely see, I think definitely having a voice in terms of how we want, you know, we're kind of at this pinnacle where we can kind of shape the future of how we're going to use and leverage AI in government systems and just in our society as a whole. And I think it's important for us to really tune into those conversations and discussions as they're being made, as well as to take an assessment and say, how do I personally feel about this? And this is the time where I should be more protective from my standpoint, where I'm like, hey, I don't want a lot of other third parties knowing all of this information about me. So I think it's more of a time to lean in to this topic more than just kind of like let it all play out. I think that's, from my answer, my perspective, not the best way to look at it.
Yeah, I agree with both Tiffany and Taylor. I just think that our voice is very powerful, especially how the government and industry already knows that we already have a lot of mistrust with how our data will be used. And building that trust requires not just the technical solutions, but a clear social contract with us, the users, so that they can commit to protecting the rights and be able to have this consent-based data usage, especially with going forward. So especially having a voice and just be aware and up to date, especially with the next 5 to 10 years of what's going to happen with UTS.
I had one more thing to add. I'd worked in, you know, a big tech company, and I really felt like there was a great shift in perspective to push for privacy. So I'd been on a lot of privacy boards, and And so I think if we're in whatever company we're in, really pushing to make sure that we're not the ones crossing those boundaries, for other people. And so kind of putting that back in front.
And on like a personal note, I think a lot of it comes with staying informed. So like in a session like this, I feel like we've all like learned something here. So that's something that we can implement kind of going forward to decide just how much of ourselves we want to put out there and like what route we want to take.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much, the Dream Team, for putting in the time to educate us on all things UTS. Definitely want to invite all the audience, our COI members, working group leaders to engage with the associate to dive more into how we actually adopt this, right? We learned a lot of great things, but now it's about how do we do this successfully? So with that, I'll give everybody back their afternoon. Thank you for joining us.